On the 25th of July in the year 1945, after years of the grueling Second World War, the US government made a decision that would end the war and change the fate of humanity forever: the use of the atomic bomb. Harry Truman, the new US president, gave the final go-ahead for the dropping of this weapon of mass destruction, which was now to end the war in the Pacific once and for all. This was of course not an easy decision, but it was intended to prevent the deaths of millions more soldiers and civilians and to weaken and surprise the Japanese to such an extent that they would surrender immediately. And so the detailed planning for the drop began immediately, and a heated debate broke out as to which cities should be wiped out. In the end, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were chosen. But why were these two comparatively insignificant cities chosen? Why didn't it hit the Japanese capital Tokyo, and why should completely different cities be bombed? Today we take a detailed look at the cruel decision that led to the death and misery of hundreds of thousands of people. First of all, we have to jump back to the year 1941, to the 7th of December that year to be precise. For in the early morning of that day, an event was to take place that would change the fate of the war and the course of history forever. In a surprise attack, the Japanese attacked the most important base of the US Pacific Fleet, Pearl Harbor. The attack resulted in the sinking or damage of 19 US warships, including 8 battleships. Approximately 2,400 Americans were killed and over 1,000 injured. Significant amounts of aircraft and military equipment were also destroyed or damaged. And the attack on Pearl Harbor had a tremendous effect on public opinion in the US. While the Americans had officially declared themselves neutral in the Second World War up to that point, this led to an immediate declaration of war the very next day, and the Americans were now officially part of the Allies. However, another important event also took place on this day after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor: the start of the Manhattan Project. In the year 1939, Albert Einstein, together with other scientists who had emigrated, wrote a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In this letter he warned of the possibility that Nazi Germany could be working on the development of an atomic weapon and that the development of this technology could be decisive for war. And after the devastating attack on the American Pacific Fleet and the official entry into the war, the development of the atomic bomb was now given top priority. Nevertheless, it would take almost another year before official work on the Manhattan Project began. This was because the appropriate infrastructure first had to be created, the best scientists recruited, and tens of thousands of other workers, from engineers to administrative staff. And all this had to be done in the utmost secrecy. General Leslie Groves was finally appointed military director of the project. And Robert Oppenheimer, an outstanding theoretical physicist, was appointed scientific director of the main laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The primary goal was to develop a nuclear weapon before Germany or another hostile nation. This weapon was to play a decisive role in the war and potentially end it once and for all. And so, after years of development, the project reached its climax on the 16th of July in the year 1945. On this day, the first successful test of an atomic bomb, known as the Trinity test, took place in the New Mexico desert. This test showed that the concepts and technologies developed as part of the Manhattan Project were actually functional. The Americans now had the leverage to decide over the lives and deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. At the time of the test, US President Truman was in Potsdam to take part in the Potsdam Conference, a meeting of Allied leaders to discuss the post-war order in Europe. He received the message in the form of a cryptic telegram from Secretary of War Henry Stimson. The telegram read, "Deployed this morning. Diagnosis not yet complete, but results seem satisfactory and already exceeding expectations." Winston Churchill also learned of the success of the test on the same day and noted in his memoirs, "Now all at once this nightmare was over, and in its place came the bright and comforting prospect that one or two shattering blows might end the war." However, it was probably only a week later that Stalin was told, relatively casually, that a new type of bomb had been developed that would break the Japanese will to war. However, it is considered certain that he also knew about the completion of the US atomic bombs on the day of the successful test through his spy Klaus Fuchs. That same evening he arranged for the construction of a Soviet atomic bomb, which had begun in the year 1943, to be accelerated. In US circles, however, there was a heated debate about the actual use of the bombs. Supporters generally claimed that they would lead to the immediate surrender of Japan and thus prevent massive losses on both sides. But opponents claimed that they were militarily unnecessary, as a naval blockade and intensified conventional bombing could also be used to force Japan to surrender unconditionally. The question of necessity is still being debated today, but it was clear to the US government that the bomb would be used. But over which Japanese cities were the bombs to be dropped? This was also the subject of heated debate within the president's circle. While Tokyo was the most obvious target in order to cause the greatest physical and psychological damage, this was quickly abandoned. There were several reasons for this. For one, Tokyo had already been subjected to intense bombing before the atomic bombs were dropped, especially during the devastating firestorm in March of the year 1945. This attack had already caused enormous destruction and high casualties. Because of this previous destruction, the additional effect and impact of an atomic bomb on the city would have been limited. After all, one of the main aims of dropping the atomic bomb was to demonstrate the power and devastating effects of the new weapon. And in order to demonstrate the full effect and destructive power of the atomic bomb, a city that had previously been less bombed or not bombed at all was preferred. Dropping the bomb on a city that had previously been less affected was also intended to maximize the surprise effect and psychological shock. But there were also other reasons. As the capital, Tokyo was a symbolic and political center, but the US wanted to select targets that also had significant military or industrial importance. In addition, there were already considerations about how to proceed with Japan after the war. The Japanese capital was to be used as a center for one. And the destruction of the capital might have made the Allies' occupation policy much more complicated. Other destinations such as Kyoto were also excluded for other reasons. U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, for example, personally lobbied for Kyoto to be removed from the target list, as he knew the city from previous visits and appreciated its cultural value. And so the choice for the first bombing quickly fell on Hiroshima. The city was an important military hub, home to several Japanese army divisions, a communications center and storage facilities for military equipment. In addition, the city had been spared major destruction up to that point, which meant that it met all the important criteria. The selection of the second city, on the other hand, was much more chaotic. The city of Kakura was originally intended as the target for the second bomb. However, poor weather conditions, including heavy cloud cover and smoke from the previous bombing in a nearby city, made it impossible to visually target Kakura. And so the pilot decided to fly to the secondary target, Nagasaki. Nagasaki was known for its shipbuilding industry and played an important role in the production of war material. The second atomic bomb is still the subject of the most heated debate today. The second atomic bombing of Nagasaki took place just 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, when the Japanese had not yet fully understood the destruction of Hiroshima. Nevertheless, even after the bombing of Nagasaki, it was to take some time before the Japanese actually surrendered completely, which is used by supporters as an argument for the second mission. The Japanese Minister of War refused to admit that the Hiroshima bomb was an atomic bomb, even in the 3 days between the drops. It was only after Nagasaki that he informed the cabinet that the Americans apparently had 100 atomic bombs and that the next target could well be Tokyo. Interestingly, this false knowledge was based on the torture of the American pilot Marcus McDilda. He testified under threat of violence that the Americans had 100 atomic bombs and that Tokyo and Kyoto would be the next atomic bomb targets. Both were lies, of course, because McDilda was not even involved in the Manhattan Project and had no idea. He told the Japanese what he thought they wanted to hear, but with this lie he probably brought the Japanese to their final surrender.